Howdy everyone. Thanks for being here with our new and snazzy improved room. This evening we're going to talk about a New Testament topic, New Testament Christology, what Jesus is in view of the New Testament. How does the New Testament view Jesus? And I think this is a good topic to do because in the last several months I feel like I've had conversations with a lot of different people about this same issue. So it seemed like a good idea to kind of devote a presentation just to that. And the purpose of this is also twofold. We're obviously going to approach this question about Jesus, what were his views of himself, but also Grant, in a couple weeks, is going to be giving a talk on confessional Christology, going through the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed. And that is a weighty topic in its own right. So we thought it'd be a good idea to kind of sift through the biblical data to kind of clear the ground so that Grant can then tackle the historical question kind of with a more full picture in view. And because of the nature of this topic, some certain things are unavoidable. This is going to be like full-scale Bible study mode tonight. This is the highest possible rating on the Bible scale. And we're not going to stop with the Bible. We're also going to go into all kinds of other Jewish literature, the Deuterocanon, Maccabees, Bel and the Dragon, you name it, all kinds of fun stuff. And I also am in no way professing to be an expert in this stuff. Whenever I quote something, I'll try to give the relevant context of the passage and cite my sources and the scholars that I'm drawing my interpretations from. And because of that, because there's so much Bible, the PowerPoints are not going to be that pretty. You're going to see a lot of text on the slides, but also conveniently, you have all the major text on the back of your handout in size 8 font. So you can also look at that, and also like if you want to keep it as a resource for yourself, like don't feel like you have to be staring at the PowerPoints, taking pictures. You have it on your handout. So
everyone got a handout, right?
Yes. So my apologies to the folks in here that are big on minimalistic PowerPoints. It's not going to be that. And also, because we are doing a lot of Bible reading tonight, we kind of need to set our ground and have a good starting point for looking at the Bible, so approach it in a methodological way. How we should approach these biblical texts. There was a preacher in the 19th century who famously or infamously, he described his Bible study method in the following way. He said, "I endeavored to read the scriptures as though no one had read them before me." And the idea here for this preacher was he didn't want to be forcing any preconceived philosophical or theological assumptions on the text, right? He wanted to try to read the Bible with what I'm going to call the blank slate method. Right? He wanted to try and scientifically figure out the meaning of the text on its own terms, right? Without any appeal to preconceived notions. And I've noticed that a lot of people, especially when discussing the nature of the divinity of Jesus, they like to approach the Bible in much the same way as this figure. I've heard people say sometimes when I just read the Gospels without any preconceived theological notions, it just doesn't seem like Jesus is God. I just doesn't see it when I come at the Bible with a blank slate. And actually, I think a lot of ways this method, this blank slate method, is kind of admirable. Because we don't want to force our preconceived notions on the text. We want to come to the text and let the text speak to us and be challenged by the text. And we shouldn't force our preconceived notions on the text. That's what we call eisegesis, importing your own assumptions on the text. However, is it really a good idea to read the text as no one has read them before? Should we really read the Bible with an absolutely blank slate? Because the Bible, and the New Testament in particular, was written to a people who were absolutely steeped in the logic of the Old Testament, right? Paul and the average Jew or Christian in that time period has forgotten more about the Old Testament than I probably will ever know. So the right method then is not probably to approach the Bible with a blank slate, but rather to have the right information on your slate so you can come to the text like the original hearers did, right? So if I want to know what the New Testament claims about Jesus, I need to steep myself in the Old Testament text, in the literature about God and how people talked about God from that time period, and I need to interpret, I need to attend to the literary patterns within the text on their own terms, right? And a lot of these, because I'm sitting right here in America, I might not catch on my first pass because I'm not quite as acquainted with the writings as those people were. And so that observation that we need to put the right things on our slate is going to drive the bulk of my presentation tonight. Because when we talk about the formation of the New Testament, there are multiple kind of overlapping contexts and conversations going on here. Right? This Second Temple Jewish thought, this informs both the logic of the epistles, also in the Gospels, and these beliefs in Second Temple Judaism, it's what we call the Judaism in the period of the Second Temple. It was informed by the Old Testament, right, the 39 books, but also by what we call the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon. These were books and texts that were being read by these people during this time. So, of course, this informs the Gospels. Also, of course, the writers of the New Testament epistles and the Gospels, they were influenced by the beliefs of the early Christian communities. And also, of course, the life of Jesus was a key, if not the major influence on the Gospels and the epistles in this time period. So you have all these overlapping contexts, and to understand one of them, you kind of got to understand all of them, right? What's the conversation saying? So tonight, we're going to try to do just that. We're going to understand how each of these kind of sections interlock and paint a picture about who they believe Jesus was. So first, we'll see how Jews in the Second Temple period thought about God, how they thought about divinity, what that meant for them. Then we'll see how Paul reframes the same Jewish beliefs, the same Jewish monotheism around the person of Jesus. And then third, we'll see how the Synoptic Gospels identify Jesus as divine precisely in the ways we would expect the early Jews to. So three things. First, monotheism in Second Temple Judaism, then Christology within the New Testament epistles, and then three, the divine identifiers in the Synoptic literature. Okay? And tonight, I'm mostly interested in kind of building up a positive case for a robust New Testament Christology. And I have some kind of implicit interlocutors here. For example, Bart Ehrman has a famous book called How Jesus Became God. And at the core, my 3 points kind of correspond to three what I feel are kind of misconceptions about how Jesus was viewed in that time period. So the first misconception is a claim that Christian belief in the co-divinity of Jesus kind of undermines traditional Jewish conceptions of monotheism. And I'm going to argue, contrary to that claim, that there actually is conceptual space within Jewish monotheism for some form of what Richard Bauckham says, real distinction within the unique identity of the one God. The second misconception is a claim that a so-called high Christology, a very high view of Jesus as God, was a late development in the church. And contrary to that position, which this position, by the way, has become a lot less popular in the last 20 or so years, I'm going to argue that the New Testament epistles portray Jesus as participating in Yahweh's unique identity, especially in the ways we would expect early Jewish theology to work. And then lastly, the last misconception is a claim that the Synoptic Gospels do not portray Jesus as God. They portray him as some man and some that Jesus never made a claim to be God. And again, contrary to this claim, I'm going to argue that the Synoptic Gospels do portray Jesus as identifying with Yahweh God, especially if we closely attend to the literary patterns of the text. Okay, any questions about where we are, where we're going to go? Okay, we'll jump into how Jews thought about God in the first century. Oh, here are my resources if you're interested. Okay, how Jews thought about God. So, the first thing we can say is that for Jews, God was absolutely unique. The first place to start with any type of Jewish conception of God was the Shema, right? And the Shema is the first few verses of Deuteronomy 6, and it was recited by Jews twice daily. We know the words well. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Very famous words, most likely. And part and parcel of this claim of God's oneness, he is singular, is also a claim of God's uniqueness. Isaiah 46:9 says, I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. So the first century Jewish conception of God was God is one, he's unique, he is singular. Which makes sense, but what does that actually look like? Like, what does that mean for them practically in the ways they would talk about God, in the ways they would conceive about God. And I think the best way to think about this question is actually answer it by contrast to how a different group would have thought about God. So when we think about how the ancient Greek philosophers tended to talk about God, in what ways, if you've heard this, would the ancient Greeks, maybe Plato or Aristotle, describe God? Do any of y'all? Yeah.
Aristotle defines God in his treatise on metaphysics as the mover, unmoved, the first chain. Well, no, the first, I can't describe him. He's not a chain. He is the thing that all else radiates from.
Yeah, the unmoved mover, right? Anyone else? Yeah.
I mean, Plato would have the idea of like a pure good.
Yeah. So notice what's in common you're saying here, right? They're defining him in terms of like unmoved mover, pure good, pure act in some, on terms of nature, on what we call ontology, right? The nature of something, what it is. And that's kind of how Greeks and those sort of philosophers thought about God. And I think this comes natural for us now, especially those of us familiar with the Western philosophical tradition, maybe with Aquinas and some of the Nicene Creed, for instance. We seem to think in similar terms. But the question is, did the early Jews think this way? Did they think in analogous terms of ontology and nature? And one scholar, Richard Bauckham, argues actually, no, they did not. And he says, if we wish to know what in the Second Temple period Judaism consisted, the uniqueness of one God to consist, we must not look for a definition of divine nature, but for ways of characterizing the unique divine identity. So Jews, more than questions of nature or ontology, look to questions of identity. And this identity, the unique identity of God, was based on a couple things. First, Jews described the unique identity based on how God had interacted with them in the past, right? How God had saved them from Egypt, how God had made those covenants with Abraham and with David, and how God had acted with them throughout history, right? And so whenever you hear talking about God, you're going to say, the Lord who led them out of Egypt. It's a big deal. Also, though, there's more ways of talking about God as if analogous in his relationship to the rest of creation, to the rest of reality, not to Israel. And this is the category we're going to focus on tonight. Because to be sure, Yahweh God had a very special relationship with Israel, but he was still the God of the entire cosmos, right? And we can break down God's relationship to the rest of reality based on two key descriptors. First is that he was the sole ruler of the universe. And secondly, he was the sole creator of the universe. We'll look at each of these in turn. First, God is the sole creator. And this is the part where we're going to kind of burst bomb. And the intention here is not to get you to remember each and every in and out of this specific text, but rather to kind of get a good impression of the ways Jews would, in their literature, talk about God. So we think of texts like Isaiah 40. We say, "To whom will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see, who created these?" Right? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. And clearly, in Isaiah 40, God is God here because of his creative power, something no one else has, right? You can say, who created these, right? Whom will you compare me to? God is incomparable and unique because he alone has created. We see something similar in Nehemiah chapter 9. This context of this passage is after the Jews, after they return from exile, the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. The people confess their sins, the law is restored. It's kind of this big revival. And in chapter 9, they have this big prayer to God, and this is how they open the prayer. They say, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them. And you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you." So when Jews addressed their prayers, this was who they were praying to. This was how they thought about God, right? Because the first thing you say when you address God is a very good indication of what your general stance towards him is, right? They're saying, "You have made heaven." And notice, the proper response here to the fact that God is the supreme creator was worship, the host of heaven, everyone in heaven worships you. You see something very similar and in 2 Maccabees chapter 1. This coincidentally also is a text about Nehemiah, although it's written from the perspective of a recollection of the Israelites are going again back to Israel, and they're relighting the temple fire that was hidden after the Babylonian invasion of the temple, and they're relighting the altar. And again, they start the prayer saying, "O Lord, Lord God, creator of all things, you are awe-inspiring and strong and merciful. You alone are king and kind and bountiful, and you alone are just and almighty and eternal." So again, creator of all things. When Jews addressed their prayers, this is who they were praying to. This is what they thought about God. And so this theme of God is God because of what he has done, his identity. Creation is just a huge aspect of it. You'll see running through basically every strata of the text. Secondly, again, we talked about how God is the sole ruler. You can think of texts like Daniel chapter 4. When you get to the exilic period, when the Israelites are no longer in their ancestral land, they're in Babylon, you start to see a lot more confrontation with these other foreign leaders and powers because, they're not in their own space. And it's kind of like a God versus Nebuchadnezzar. And you start to see this emphasis that God is God, not just of the Jews, but also of everyone. And this actually is after Nebuchadnezzar. He is kind of punished by his own usurping of God's authority, and he repents afterwards. And he says, I lifted up my eyes to heaven, my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. A similar text in Bel and the Dragon, also about Daniel. This is a kind of a very interesting passage. It's like a cross between 1 Kings 18, kind of the competition on Mount Carmel. It's a contrast with that and like Daniel 1. It's a fascinating text. But Daniel says also to King Nebuchadnezzar, I don't worship anyone except the Lord God who created the heaven and earth, see the creation again, and also him who has sovereignty over all flesh. So those ideas, creator and king, are very often paired together. And of course, you see that also in the same text from the last slide, 2 Maccabees 1, the prayer says, you alone are awe-inspiring, you alone are king and kind, right? So those two attributes, creation and king, are paired right together in most of the text. So Richard Bauckham, this scholar I'm drawing on, he sums up these facts and he emphasizes what this means for the worship of God. He says, Jews understood the practice of monolatry, that's the worship of one God, to be justified, indeed required, because the unique identity of Yahweh was so understood to place him not merely at the summit of a hierarchy of divinity, but in an absolutely unique category beyond comparison with anything else. Worship was the recognition of this unique incomparability of the one God. It was the response to Yahweh's self-revelation as the sole creator and ruler of all. And I think we can get that impression from the few texts I just cited, right? God's unique. There is no one else like him because of what he has done. He alone is the creator. He alone is the ruler, not merely at the top of some summit of divinity, but rather in a completely different category. God is unique because he alone is the creator. He alone is the sole ruler. And that is an absolutely huge point to understand as we go into kind of the more fuzzier territory, because there are some complicating factors we must address. Some people might have the question, where does God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, fit into all these lowercase g gods or intermediary figures? And Addie, I know, is probably interested in this. She gave a presentation on kind of the divine counsel in the Hebrew Bible, how there seems to be in places like Psalm 82, like kind of these angels maybe that God assigns to do things, and it's kind of this weird thing. There's, it's not just humans around, right? There's kind of this cosmos of different things. And Richard Bauckham, or New Testament scholars, will generally term these to be intermediary figures. So think like Abraham ascends to heaven, was considered in that world to be a sort of intermediary figure. Think of the archangel Michael. Think of maybe the angel Gabriel, those sort of people. So where do they fit into the picture? And there are actually a couple categories of work here. First are the principal angels and exalted patriarchs, like I just said, with if Abraham is exalted, or when Elijah kind of doesn't die and is ascended to heaven. And the angels, of course, Michael. And then you have these personified divine aspects. And this category is a lot fuzzier. Think right now about how wisdom is described in the opening chapters of Proverbs. Wisdom's crying out in the streets. And we'll get to that later. But the question here is, do either of these categories participate in any way in the unique divine identity? And Richard Bauckham argues this first category does not, but the second category actually does. So let's delve deeper into each category. The first category is the principal angels. And this, like I said, can get a little bit hairy at times because in some instances it does seem like these principal angels are ruling and they sometimes exercise some degree of authority. So does this mean that the angels are kind of like a lesser version of God? So we're going to look at a case study, and this particular case study is the angel Metatron. His name actually means the lesser Yahweh. It kind of, to me, sounds like a transformer. There's some debate whether Metatron is equivalent to Michael or whether Metatron is equivalent to the Enochic Son of Man. I don't know. So could be not. But there's an interesting instance in 3rd Enoch where Metatron is sitting on this throne. It says, I, Metatron, was sitting upon a great throne at the door of the 7th hall in heaven, and I was judging the children of heaven, the household on high by authority of the Holy One. Blessed be he, that's God. And this prophet kind of has a vision, and he's summoned up into the heaven, and he sees Metatron on the throne. And he says, when Archer, that's the prophet, beheld me sitting upon a throne like a king, with all the ministering angels standing by me as my servants, and all the princes of kingdoms adorned with crowns surrounding me, in that moment he opened his mouth and said, indeed, there are 2 divine powers in heaven. So this prophet, Archer, sees Metatron sitting on kind of the throne in heaven, and he has a reaction that maybe we would have this reaction and say, whoa, this is pretty crazy. Maybe there is like 2 gods or something. There's 2 powers up there. But not so fast, because see how the story progresses. In the next verse, it says, forthwith, Bath Qual, the divine voice, went forth from heaven, and before Shekinah and said, return, ye backsliding children, except Archer. Then came Aniel, the prince, the honored, glorified, beloved, wonderful, revered, and fearful one, in commission from the Holy One, blessed be he, and gave me 60 strokes with lashes of fire, and made me stand on my feet. So as soon as this human prophet Archer makes this declaration, the voice from the higher heaven, notice God isn't in this picture, he's in a higher heaven, his voice resounds, instantly rebukes them, and sends another angel to come kick Metatron off the throne and like beat him up. So it's like pretty clear, there's not 2 powers in heaven, like it's God, and any judgment that Metatron might be exercising is purely derivative. It's purely based on God's power, right? So there's a clear distinction between Yahweh and everyone else. And sure, in this thought, some Jews thought there might have been different angels that had different powers, but they just were not simply on par with Yahweh God. It wasn't even a comparison. In other words, we would say, you don't even mention Yahweh God and someone else in the same sentence. They're not even playing the same game, not even in the same ballpark. So that's the principal angels. Any questions there? Yes, Addie.
Okay, so you mentioned like Heiser and some of the Old Testament stuff. So the angel of Yahweh, especially when he wrestles with Jacob, and then Jacob gets renamed Israel, which means he who has wrestled with God. Occasionally, that angel of Yahweh seems to also be sharing in the identity of Yahweh. Would that be a different figure type of thing than these intermediary figures?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Richard Bauckham says, like, Michael Heiser, like, it's an interesting because Richard Bauckham has a different perspective. And he says kind of that he's going at it from the reference that a lot of people say, oh, the angel of the Lord is Yahweh. And he says, yeah, that's a good Christian who can make that argument, but like he doesn't see it in the text. And wasn't sure if people were actually making that argument in that literature. So I would say generally unsure, but probably was something a little bit different. Okay. Let's get into the next category. This might kind of also go with your question. God's wisdom. So the second category of intermediary figures is the so-called personified divine aspects. And by itself, that framing sounds kind of abstract. So we'll look at an example in Wisdom of Solomon, another deuterocanonical text. It says, "Give me the wisdom that sits by your throne," that's God's throne, "and do not reject me from among your children. Send her forth from the holy heavens, and from your throne of your glory send her, that she may labor at my side, and that I may learn what is pleasing to you." So here we have this attribute of God, his wisdom, and in some way, God's wisdom seems personified, right? The reference to by the throne even seems like a reference to wisdom ruling, maybe, so kind of strange. But it gets even more interesting when we consider a text like 2 Enoch 33, where God says, "And there is no advisor and no successor to my creation. I am self-eternal and not made by hands. My thought is without change. My wisdom is my advisor, and my deed is my word." So God says, hey, no one helps me in creation. No one gives me advice. It was just me. And then he says, wisdom was my advisor in creation. So it's kind of weird, right? God says, I have no advisors. Wisdom was my advisor. We also get a similar sense something's going on analogously with God's word in these texts. And you might think, well, yeah, that just could be some type of figure of speech, a metaphor that's not meant to be taken quite literally. I guess there really some guy named Wisdom running around. I don't know. That's an interpretation you can have. Richard Bauckham's kind of agnostic on the question. But if you look at texts like Wisdom of Solomon, a little before this, chapter 7, it's on the back of your sheet, Wisdom of Solomon 7:22, there's a pretty long description of wisdom. It says, there is in her a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, agile, clear, unpolluted, goes on, listing adjectives, and says, she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her. She is a reflection of the eternal light, and so on and so on. And my point here, and Bauckham's point, is that this stuff is far beyond what gets said about the principal angels like Metatron and Micah, Michael. Because you have here a reference to rule, but also creation, right? No one helped me in creation, my wisdom did. So it's kind of this weird territory. Bauckam argues, and other scholars follow, that what's going on here is that these kind of personified divine aspects are being placed as intrinsic to the unique divine identity, right? He says they're not created beings, they're not occupying some semi-ambiguous, quasi-divine status. They belong to the unique divine identity. Because wisdom participates in God's rule in creation, his two key features, therefore, wisdom participates in the identity of God. And Bauckam further says that this Jewish thought, it does not define the uniqueness of God as unitariness. And it does not make distinctions unthinkable, right? It does not make distinctions within the divine identity inconceivable. It is perfectly clear distinction between God and all other reality, for example, the other principal angels. But in this case, wisdom is placed unequivocally within the unique divine identity. So in other words, Jews had language in their vocabulary to make distinctions within God's identity. And this God, they all confess to be one from the Shema. The Lord, he is one. But also, there's wisdom too. So there's kind of some ambiguity there. Any questions there on the wisdom? Yeah.
Is that encroaching on heretical from the standpoint of we were talking about God's essence, you can't be divided?
Yeah, going the divine simplicity route.
I mean, or in the creeds.
Yeah. And the divine simplicity would be like saying the creeds imply that God cannot be parts. Again, I think we set ourselves backwards when we talk about the Jewish thought in terms of essence and nature, because those weren't terms they were thinking in. And I think you're thinking about distinctions, but maybe that's not the same thing as parts. And trying to combine this Greek way of thinking with the Jewish way of thinking, and they're not necessarily at odds or in contradiction, but they're also trying to kind of answer different questions, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So, this is my first time being here.
Yeah, sure thing.
Trying to get a bit of clarification. Is there a particular reason why you're choosing
lesser read books that were used by the Jewish. It was more using the Greek, the Septuagint, rather than the Hebrew Bible.
Well, it's a great question. The reason I'm kind of referencing these texts is because they were the texts that would have been read at that time period by those people, and so it's representative of what kind of things they would be thinking about God. Not that they're inspired or anything. I don't think that. Yeah. Just that they're a good litmus test for what people were talking about. Yeah, Ben.
I've heard that the Hebrew word used in Deuteronomy when describing God as one is not necessarily the same word that's used like one singular in other parts of the Bible. It's the same. I've actually heard that it's the same word one used in the place where the Bible talks about man and wife becoming one. And I don't know if you've also if the text the books you read talk about that as well, or if that's a coincidence or.
They actually didn't. I would have to go look into that. I'm not sure off the top of my head like what the answer would be to that.
It's the word ihad versus
Ihad?
yahid.
Okay.
And ihad means like a collection.
Yeah, I'm not a Hebrew guy, so it sounds plausible, but okay. So yeah, it's kind of a weird thing, and yeah.
Sorry, I'm wondering how does would this idea also interact with Proverbs 8?
Refresh me, Proverbs 8.
Proverbs 8 is about wisdom.
The wisdom? Yeah. It's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Wisdom of Solomon's kind of like in the same vein of like Solomon's writing, so it's I think the same thing's going on. I think it's a much earlier rendition of it. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, all that to say, all that talk about, and we're already running short on time. In Jewish thought, God is defined not by ontology, not by nature, but by identity. And so by asking what God is, we answer the question who God is. And in this Jewish thought, God's identity was characterized by his sovereign and creative power. And thirdly, there is conceptual space within Jewish monotheism for some type of real distinction within the unique identity of the one God. So wisdom is clearly on the divine side of the line, and whichever way that kind of works is not clear. And so it is possible to say different things about God. Okay, so now we can finally be happy because we're moving on to the New Testament, outside all those weird and wacky deuterocanonical texts. So how did the earliest New Testament texts describe Jesus? How did they fit into this Jewish tradition of talking about God? And so I'm going to argue that from the earliest portions of the New Testament, Jesus was, in fact, lumped in with the unique identity of God. And he is pictured as both participating in the creation and rule of God. So that's where we're going next. Pop quiz before we get there. Do any of y'all, off the top of your head, know what the most quoted Old Testament passage is by New Testament writers? There's a couple good candidates for this. No, good guess.
Is it the love of the Lord your God with all your might?
Good guess. That's the Shema. Yeah. It's in the Psalms. It's actually Psalm 110. So that's the text. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. It's the one that talks about God, making Jesus the Lord in this text, a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And this psalm is very, very frequently quoted all across different portions of the New Testament. And it's also often combined with Psalm 8, which is, O Lord, how majestic is your name over all the earth. And it says, describing the Son of Man here, you have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. And right, the Son of Man probably in its original form wasn't intending to go to like some kind of Messiah, but that's how the earliest Christians interpreted it, right? And a great example of this kind of combining these together to say something about Jesus was in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It says, for he, that's Christ, must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet, right? You see, that's the Psalm 110. For God has put all things in subjection under his feet, but when it says all things are put into subjection, it is plain that he is accepted who put all things in subjection under him. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to him who put all things in subjection under him, that God may be all in all. So a lot of putting in subjection there, kind of a tongue twister. But you can see in this text, you have Christ, they're interpreting him to be the Lord in Psalm 110, is exalted, and he's lifted up into a ruling capacity over the earth. All things are under his feet. You might look at this and say, well, there is clearly some type of distinction going on here in 1 Corinthians 15, right? Because it seems like maybe God the Father is the one that's exalting him. He's lifting him up, and it even says things will be subjected to him who put all things under his subjection, right? So you could read this and say, is this something similar then to what's going on with angel Metatron in 3rd Enoch? Is this some kind of thing where Jesus' rule is derivative of God in some way and not quite on the same level in a different category, and God's still the supreme one? And I think there are reasons in the text to say no to that interpretation. But also, and we can talk about that, but we're already running short on time. So we need to talk about another text in the same book that absolutely, I think, precludes that explanation. And that is 1 Corinthians 8, verse 6. 1 Corinthians 8, verse 6. And this, for contextual reference, takes place within the passage where Paul is talking about meat being sacrificed to idols and how it's the concern is explicitly monotheistic, right? It's about loyalty to the one true God. Paul says, for although there are many so-called gods in heaven or earth, there are many gods and lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, the one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. Now, I've tried to break down this text so we get a feel for its structure. But the first thing to note is that in lines A and C, Paul is pretty clearly making an allusion to the Shema, right? The Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And this allusion is pretty much in the literature unanimously recognized by everyone. They say, yeah, Paul is referencing this key Jewish text. And I've tried to highlight portions here to bring out the similarities. And do you see what's so significant about this? Paul is taking the number one, the central Jewish monotheistic text that was cited twice a day, and he's redefining it around Jesus. He's redefining monotheism as Christological monotheism. He's saying there is one God the Father and one Lord, Jesus Christ. So he's identifying Jesus with the Lord. The Shema proclaims to be one. Yes, David.
The words that you're highlighting, would the Greek that Paul is using correspond to the words in the Septuagint for Deuteronomy 6?
Yeah, that's the purpose there. So that's why it's kind of like not, it doesn't seem perfect when you're reading it in English, but it's closer if you're in the Greek. And again, I'm not a scholar. I'm going off what the people that know the Greek are saying. But yeah, that's pretty cool, that clear interpretation. But the second part of this line is also interesting. B and D is another common Jewish monotheistic formula, this time explicitly associated with creation. We see a kind of unedited version of this in Romans 11:36. God is described as, for from him and through him and to him are all things. So here this is a reference to God the Father. And so this is a pretty big deal, right? Because remember, in the literature of the early Jews, there was no one that assisted God in creation. No one. Except you could say wisdom. And wisdom was on the divine side of the line. He was participating in the unique identity of Yahweh. What was that?
She was participating.
Yes. Oh, Shri. Yeah. You're correct. Yeah. So yeah, this is a huge text because he's taking these very, very intense Jewish monotheistic formulas, and he is reformulating them to express a Christological monotheism, which Bauckham says by no means abandons, but precisely maintains the ways Judaism distinguished God from all other reality and uses these to include Jesus in the unique divine identity. So it's pretty interesting. You get another flavor of this in Colossians chapter 1. We get the same line even. All things were created through him and for him, this same kind of monotheistic formula. We say all things, for by him all things were created. And what's interesting about this passage in particular is that a lot of scholars think, for a couple of reasons, that Paul is quoting some type of early hymn or creed. something he didn't really come up with on his own. And what this means is, right, before you can quote a hymn, it has to have time to be written and gain traction and be quotable, right? Which means that this hymn, if he really is quoting a hymn, it would be a lot older than Colossians. And so we're pushing back earlier and earlier date, where we have a very, very high view of Jesus as the one that all creation was for, participating in God's creation, right? So a very, very high Christology, very early. One more text in the New Testament is Jesus is given the divine name, the translation of the Tetragrammaton, in Romans 10:13, and also a lot of places all over the New Testament, but most notably here I picked. And this, of course, Romans 10, in the thick of Paul's argument in Romans 9, 10, and 11 about Jews and Gentiles and what's all going on with that. And Paul's argument here is explicitly monotheistic. Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Does anyone know, actually, I spoiled it, what passage that's quoting? It's Joel 2. Joel 2, the same passage that's quoted in Acts by the Apostle Peter, right? The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So the word for Lord there it's the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh. That's God's covenant name, right? This is God saying everyone who calls on my name will be saved. And who is Paul applying that to? It's pretty clearly Jesus, right? Right? If you confess that Jesus is Lord, the same Lord is Lord of all, monotheism, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Also in Joel 2, you have a very explicit monotheistic formula, right? That I am the Lord, there is no one else. And Paul even quotes that part. So he knows that verse is there. He's not saying, oh, there's two gods, Jesus and someone else. No, he's saying Jesus is the person that's saying this here in this text. That's Paul interpreting this text. So it's pretty clear in my estimation that Paul is attributing the divine name Yahweh to Jesus. Again, Bauckham says, Romans 10:13 is the climax of a clear statement of Christological monotheism, which makes identification of Jesus with Yahweh. The identifying name Yahweh names Jesus as well as God his Father, and in such a way, they are certainly not two gods. So there's a ton of stuff to unpack here, and a lot to keep unpacking, but these are the things that I want to emphasize about what the general early New Testament picture is that Paul is redefining Jewish monotheism around Jesus. He's not creating some bitheistic structure where there's two gods. No, he's explicitly quoting the traditional Jewish monotheistic text, right? Like the Shema, like Joel 2, and he's applying them to Jesus. Of course, there is a pretty clear distinction between Jesus and the Father, right? We get a flavor of that distinction in Colossians 1, in 1 Corinthians 15. But remember, in the Second Temple Jewish thought, distinction is not necessarily at odds with disunity, right? You can have some of that ambiguity there. So there's distinction, but Christ is defined as pre-existent. Oh, where did it go? That's not good. Anyway, there's distinction, but Christ is defined as obviously. Here we go. Well, we have the text. Okay, there we go. We have the text either way in your handout. But pre-existent, the active agent in God's rule, 1 Corinthians 15. Also, the active agent in creation, given the divine name and worshipped. So that's a pretty high Christology, very, very, very high opinion of Jesus, very early in the church. Yes.
Sorry. What does it mean when Paul and other writers of the New Testament consistently refer to Jesus as Lord and the Father as God, almost in a way that's contrasting? Like, hey, we have one God and we have one Lord.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think they're trying to like kind of draw out these terms to express this fact, and they're kind of not quite sure how to do that. Because, like I said, there is distinction. That's perfectly clear. And so there is distinction on who's acting in the role of Jesus and the role of God we would call the Father. And they're trying to draw out that distinction, but also draw out that the same God in some sort of way. So again, continuity, discontinuity, ambiguity. But again, not implausible within the Jewish context is what I would say. Does that kind of help?
Yeah, so it's like, it sounds like you're saying that, like, they're trying to say Jesus is divine, but they don't want to call him God.
Well, they are
They
calling.
don't mix him together.
They are
Saying
calling
he
him
is the
God.
same thing as the Father.
Yeah, they're saying he's.
There's a distinction, like you're saying.
There's a distinction. He's clearly participating in the divine identity, right? Yahweh, God of Israel, is pretty clearly identified with Jesus, but also there is distinction between the God that Jesus in the Gospels called my Father, right? So I'm trying to, like, this is the thing with this Christology. You're trying to, like, make these clear distinctions, and so is Paul in these texts, and be very careful in the way you're talking about things, I think. And so that's kind of what's going on. Grant might weigh in on that.
We don't have time.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so now after we have this, all this very high Christology, the question we have to ask is, why? Why is all of a sudden we have this kind of radical innovation in Jewish thought? Because yes, I said it's comprehensible, there's conceptual space for it, but identifying wisdom as God and identifying Jesus, this crucified man, as God, are two vastly different things. What's going on? How did this happen? And now I think finally we can approach the Synoptic Gospels, and maybe they can help us answer this question. And so, do the Gospels, which are about the life, purport to be about the life of Jesus, give us any clues about how people started to believe these things so shortly after his death? And I'm going to focus on the literary portrayal of one episode in the Gospel of Mark, because it's long been a truism in New Testament scholarship that, yeah, Mark has a pretty low Christology. He doesn't think Jesus is God. And I think that's, like, patently false. So we're going to see this one episode. There's a new book out by, we're going to skip this, a guy named Brant Petre. He's a Roman Catholic scholar. But he goes through the Synoptic Gospels and catalogs 10 instances where he believes the Gospel authors and Jesus are making some sort of divine claim. And we're not going to go through all of these. I think some of these are stronger than others. This is also on your handout. And there's also some that I think he also misses in here that we could say that aren't in here. But we're going to focus on how Jesus is portrayed as walking on water. This text is found in Matthew, Mark, and John. And Matthew's version is the version where kind of Peter gets out and tries to walk on water, and it doesn't go very well for him. But we're going to focus on the version in Mark chapter 6. We'll read it very quickly. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. So that's our text. The first question we should ask, okay, is, well, who walks on the sea? Like, is there any Old Testament text about this, especially if the Jews were familiar with their Old Testament? And it turns out there is. Job chapter 9, Job is kind of saying this hymn of praise to God in this midst of his suffering. And he says, God alone, this is the Septuagint, God alone stretched out the sky and walks on the sea as on dry ground, who makes Pleiades and Venus and does great and inscrutable things. So in Job, it's pretty clear. Hey, there's one guy that walks on the sea. That's God. God alone. So again, this text is part of the Jewish repertoire, part of the Jewish imagination. Our second question should be, well, does anyone else, maybe in that time period, claim also to walk on the sea? And the answer also actually is yes. Antiochus Epiphanes, the infamous murderer of the Jews in the Maccabean era, the notable blasphemer, also claimed to walk on the sea. This text in 2 Maccabees says, so Antiochus carried off 1,800 talents from the temple and hurried in his way to Antioch, thinking in his arrogance that he could sail on the land and walk on the sea because his mind was elated. And elsewhere in Maccabees, it's very clear, according to this portrayal of him, that he believed himself to be a god. And that's how he's actually punished by this at the end of Maccabees, this very gruesome scene where he dies in a similar fashion to Herod in Acts, kind of being eaten by worms. And he says, it is right to be subject to God. Mortals should not think they are equal to God. So Antiochus Epiphanes kind of makes the divine claim by saying he can walk on the water. You have a similar instance with Gaius Caligula. He chartered kind of this like floating bridge across the ocean so he could ride his chariot, it says, in a manner befitting his godhead. So the idea in this era is walking on the seas is something God does, right? Making that claim is making it a claim to divinity. Pretty interesting. Another interesting thing about this text is the presence of some pretty clear echoes of Old Testament theophanic language. So one, it could also mean Job 9, this business about passing by. We have this discussion that says Jesus meant to pass them by, and this remark has like kind of confused, baffled commentators for centuries. Even St. Augustine kind of like comes up with the most bizarre interpretation of this text. But if you compare it to Job 9, again, in the same passage as God alone walks in the sea, it says, behold, he passes me by, and I see him not. And again, in Old Testament theophany, which is when kind of God comes in his glory and meets mortal man, you had this language frequently occur of passing by. Exodus 33, Moses is told to stand in the cleft of the rock while God's glory passes by. In 1 Kings 19, when Elijah, on the same mountain of Sinai, God passes by in this still small voice. And so it's this kind of Old Testament theophanic language, the same thing that all saw and were terrified. That is a very common theme to see in the Old Testament when God appears, and everyone's like terrified, and God says, fear not. Very, very common thing. But the real kicker, in my estimation, is what Jesus says when they're terrified. What we have here is what I think is the divine I am. He says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And this phrase in the Greek has no predicate, right? It has no part of the sentence that's describing the verb. It's just, I am, it's me. It's what we would translate the I am for in the Old Testament. And if you're not familiar, in Exodus 3, the burning bush scene, God tells Moses, when people ask you who sent me, tell them, I am who I am. Say to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. And beginning in Exodus and throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, I am functions kind of like this other name for God. It's some way, again, I'm not a Hebrew expert, linguistically connected to the name Yahweh. And so it's a way God is identified. We see something similar, again, with the fear not in Isaiah 43. I am he, this Jewish identification of God, and then fear not, O Jacob my servant, whom I have chosen. So some translators would take this and say, well, it's not a lot there. Jesus is just saying, hey guys, it's me. Like I would knock on the door to Grant's house and say, hey Grant, it's me. Not a big deal there. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. But it's not just like Jesus is knocking on Peter's door saying, hey, it's me. He's saying, fear not, I am, as he's walking on the water about to pass them by, right? So it seems to be very clear that the thrust of this passage, the literary intention of the author, evangelist Mark, is to portray this kind of theophany. It's couched in the Old Testament terms, right? So again, to sum up, they describe Jesus walking on water, and this is something only God does, and only people who are blaspheming, like Antiochus Epiphanes, only they kind of usurp this authority in their own certain way, right? They describe this using classic theophany language, and of course, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, I am, is invoked by Jesus. And so this is just one example of like that 10 we could go through. And again, not all of them are as strong as this one, and not all of them are making an explicit like God of Israel claim. Some are, some aren't. But I think this is super fascinating. And Brent Petre goes through this in greater detail. And Richard Hayes, another scholar, adds a few to the mix, like cursing the fig tree being an echo of Jeremiah 7. And Mark opens by quoting Isaiah 40, Malachi 3, these other kind of very, very interesting intertextual echoes of Yahweh God in the Old Testament, applying him to Jesus in some certain way. But a good question to ask here is, okay, why isn't it more obvious? Why doesn't Jesus come out and say, hello, everyone, it's me, I am the God of Israel? Why doesn't this happen? And this is actually, I think, a pretty good question, and we can say a couple things about it. First, it's pretty clear that Jesus taught in riddles and parables. This is like historical bedrock. Part of his modus operandi is to teach in these riddles so that some may see and some may perceive, but others will not see and will not perceive. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus quotes Isaiah chapter 6 and says, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see and not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. So what we get here is, I think it's commonly referred to as the apocalyptic or messianic secret of Jesus, right? He doesn't come out and say things directly. That's not how Jesus operates. That would kind of violate kind of the principle, his modus operandi of his ministry. And I think what's going on is the synoptic evangelists are shaping the narratives to reflect this. So Richard B. Hayes wrote an excellent book called Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, and he says, for Mark, the character of God's presence in Jesus is a mystery that only can be approached by indirection, by riddle-like allusions to the Old Testament, as several passages prior in the Passion narrative indicate. By refusing to trumpet the secret identity, instead of signifying it through a mysterious symbolated narrative, Mark is teaching his readers the question to listen more deeply before they start talking about things too wonderful for their understanding. So the evangelists are kind of picking up on this idea of a messianic secret and making you really listen and pay attention. Because how many of you, when you read the passage in Mark 6 about walking water, went and straight, oh yeah, that's like talking about Job? I personally wouldn't have, like, unless someone pointed it out to me. But once you see it, like, you see it. So it's pretty interesting. The hermeneutical key for reading Mark, and I think much of the Synoptic Gospels, is pay attention. Pay attention to what you hear. Nothing is hidden except to be made manifest, which is what Jesus says in Mark chapter 4, verse 21. Okay, so we're past time, so we'll finally sum up. My big 3 points, I hope I've proved them or established them in some level of confidence. Second Temple Jews were strictly monotheistic, and they defined God by his unique identity. Very early within the life of the church, Jewish monotheism was being redefined around Jesus. And then our earliest sources about the life of Jesus, the Synoptic Gospels, they portray Jesus as the God of Israel, as God coming back to Zion. So the question is, what's the best explanation of this historical data? Something had to have caused it, right? Beliefs don't spring out of nowhere. And one of the answers people will give is for example, Bart Ehrman, famous, infamous New Testament scholar. He says that, the resurrection caused it. These people believed to have saw Jesus. Bart doesn't believe in the resurrection, but he thinks people believed to have saw him. And this kind of created this belief in a divine Messiah, and it kind of spiraled, and eventually you end up with Philippians and Colossians, and then down the road you have Nicaea. And I think Bart's onto something. I think the resurrection is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for kind of beliefs in the divinity of Jesus. Because things are just altogether different. Like, there's beliefs of people getting raised from the dead, but this is like a whole another sort of level. So I think when you consider the data in totality, the strong historical probability is that Jesus did make some sort of divine claim to be identified with Yahweh God in some way, through parables, through actions, as an apocalyptic teacher. He made divine claims, right? And I think by far this is the most parsimonious explanation of the data, right? It accounts for the rise of early Christian beliefs. It accounts for the gospel portrayals of Jesus. It accounts for the charges of blasphemy against Jesus, which he was probably executed by either the Romans or the Sanhedrin by. And so I think the strong historical probability is that Jesus did make divine claims. Brent Peter sums it up. Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish prophet who used parables, questions, and allusions to Jewish scriptures to both conceal and reveal the secret of his heavenly sonship and divine messiahship. And that is my thesis tonight. Okay, that is what we have. We're kind of over time. I don't know how they are in here with strict with time stuff. I'll be outside fielding questions. Thanks for coming, everyone. We had a great turnout, especially with the room snafu we had. So thank you all for being here. Hope to see you at one of our small groups, or especially, if y'all could, take out your phones, register for Veritas as soon as you can. Thank you, and gig 'em.